As our dependence on technology increases, we are seeing an increased level of sophistication in the cyber attacks. We are seeing new attacks that are coming up using technologies like AI and cryptocurrencies and blockchain to allow the attacker to move faster in our organization. In 2020, the average cost of a data breach was estimated to be $3.9 million. But organizations that had a robust security architecture, we've seen that they experience 86% fewer cyber attacks, and they are 70% able to detect attacks when they are initiated against the organization. So if you think about that, that's not just security. That's better business as well. Now, have you ever wondered why some organizations get repeatedly breached, whereas others remain secure? The difference isn't in the tools that they have. The difference is in their architectural mindset. Welcome to the Cyber Architect. I'm Cornelius, and in this episode, I want to go into the details to help you understand how to think like an architect. I'm going to cover the core concepts that allow architects to look at an enterprise and think about a holistic approach to securing that environment. We are going to cover things like the CIA triad. We are going to cover what it means to have an asset, vulnerability, and threats. And we are going to think about how does an architect think? How does it compare with a building or construction architect? I hope you enjoy this episode. Now, when I speak to colleagues, they ask me questions about which devices are we using? Are you using Cisco firewall versus a Fortinet firewall? What intrusion detection system are you using? My answer is usually very simple. It's not about the security tools. It's not about having the shiny tools in your environment. It's about ensuring that each of those tools is put together in a coherent manner, in a manner that enables the business to operate effectively, but at the same time ensuring that the core areas of their environment, including the core assets and core systems, are secured. Now, before we dive into the technical elements, let's understand what it means to think like an architect. Security architecture borrows a lot from the construction architects. So when a construction architect is thinking about putting a design for a skyscraper, they're not going to start by looking at the doorknobs or the elevators and what buttons are going to be used. They'll think about the entire system that is required to withstand the pressures around the natural causes like earthquakes and floods. They will think about the load-bearing material that they're going to use to ensure that the building stands. They'll think about the flow of people and material in and out of the building. And more importantly, they will not lay a brick in that building until the entire building is designed. In the same way, security architects think about the entirety of an ecosystem. We think about what systems are going to exist in an environment. We think about how the users are going to use the systems that we have, the levels of interaction that is going to happen in the ecosystem of an environment. And then once we have that full understanding, we really want to make sure we understand what is it that we are protecting, how are we going to protect it, and how do we ensure that we consistently measure the level of effectiveness of the preventative or detective or responsive controls that we've put in, and be able to get that feedback loop and be able to optimize the controls as we go. So the other important thing that people confuse is what really is a cybersecurity architecture? Now, the way to think about the cybersecurity architecture is that it's not just the technical mechanisms that we have. So we don't just go straight and jump in to start looking at the firewalls that we have or the intrusion detection systems. We have to start to think about the business context in which we are operating. So the best way to think about cyber architect is to start from the level of a strategy. Now, in the context of cybersecurity, we are thinking about what is the business that we are operating in. In that business we're operating in, what are the key things that we want to protect? And why do we want to protect that? So this is where the concept of the what and the why comes in. You're trying to set the strategy that is then going to drive everything else that you're going to do. At this level, we are defining what are the risk tolerances that we're going to have. What are the requirements that we need to make sure we meet? What are the regulatory obligations that we have that we need to make sure that we are designing for? Once you have that level of understanding, and that it has to be clearly documented so that people can move in the same direction. Once you have that set, then you go into the how. And the how is where we are now defining the security architecture. This is where we are defining the blueprints. We are trying to look at How is it that we're going to meet the business requirements that we've set? How is it that we're going to embed security into the environment to ensure that we're still aligning to the business requirements, but keeping the most sensitive and the information that we want to protect to be protected according to the risk tolerance that we've set. Once we've defined the how, then we need to go into the implementation. And in the implementation, this is where we are now defining the technical mechanism. So now the discussion about the firewalls and what intrusion detection system, what level of protection we are going to enforce comes in at the implementation. You're looking at the configurations that you're going to apply. You're looking at what ports you're going to open. You're looking at what the strength of the passwords you're going to enforce. That is the implementation of the how. Say a strategy might say, we want to protect customer data, because if we do not protect that customer data, we might be fined 50 million. So you can see you're already defining the what, which is the data that you have, the customer data, and the why is then being driven by the regulatory requirement. Now, security architecture then will look at how are we going to achieve that? What are the interactions between the different systems? What are the user journeys that will exist in that environment to support the business? But at the same time, then we look at where do we put the appropriate security controls to ensure that the data that we are mostly interested in is protected. In this sense, security architects are bridging the gap between the business and that strategy that the organization is driving and the implementation. And again, the emphasis being we don't just jump straight into the implementation. We are looking at what is the business that we're trying to support. And then we define the how, we define the blueprints on how we're going to do it. And then we guide the implementation. We guide the technicians, network engineering, Unix engineering, and teams like that that are building the infrastructure to ensure that they're meeting the requirements. The security architect will be thinking about how is this system connected. They understand that if you do not control or configure one server properly, here is the impact that it might have on the rest of the interconnected systems. So security controls are then designed. So we are now thinking about how do we embed security controls. We are thinking about the interdependencies between the systems that we have. And we are constantly asking ourselves, how can we implement stricter security controls, but at the same time ensuring that the business processes are operating as required by the business. So we are trying to find that right balance between the controls that we are putting in and ensuring that the business continues to operate. Now, let's think about an example of an airline. For an airline, a technician might be looking at endpoint agents. They may be looking at what tools do we have on the operating system? How do we tune those tools to ensure that we are collecting the logs? For an architect, they'll be thinking about what does the checkout process look like? What systems are involved in the checkout process? And how do we ensure that as the systems are communicating, how do we ensure that they're communicating in an effective and secure manner? They look at what network policies are going to be implemented, not exactly which configuration will be applied on the firewall to enforce that particular network connection. Their aim is to design the environment in a way that enables the business, not to block the business. And that requires a whole system thinking, not just the security components that are involved. We have to look at the entirety of the system and really understand that whatever we are doing for the business is enabling them, but at the same time protecting the core areas of the business. Now, the key concept that we try to drive the architectural decisions on is three key concepts. We talk about threats, we talk about assets, and we talk about vulnerabilities. So going back to the airline example again, we have to think about what are the assets for an airline. So we have to define the assets that we have in that environment. Some of the examples of the assets in the airline example might be the customer data, or it might be financial transactions for the payments that they are receiving, or credit card numbers. So that is the asset that they're trying to protect. Other types of assets might also be physical assets. They may be interested in protecting the security of the airplanes themselves. It may be buildings or security of the airport or the lounge, as an example. So those are the assets that they're trying to protect. Once the assets are understood, we have to then understand what are the threats. Now, when we talk about threats, we are talking about what are the actors, and this could be natural causes like disasters and earthquakes and so on, as well as actors. So these could be threat actors, people that are then interested in trying to compromise the assets. So that's how we think about it. We define the assets and we think about what are the entities, natural or unnatural causes, that may affect the security of the assets that we are interested in. And I'll come to the definition of what security means in a moment. But for now, just understand that we have assets and we have threats that are interested in those assets. I mean, again, it may not be interested, but it may be, as a natural cause, as an example, it's something that could affect the asset. The last piece of the puzzle is vulnerabilities. And what we are saying here is we understand that our asset will exist in some environment. So it could be a physical environment, or it could be a digital environment, cloud, on-prem, and so on. And in that environment, they may be exposed to misconfigurations, or it may be exposed to features within maybe the system itself or within the environment that they operate. And those features may result in weaknesses that could then be exploited by the threat actors that we've discussed. So again, remember, vulnerabilities is a property or a feature or some misconfiguration around the environment in which the assets are operating that could be exploited by the threat actors in order to compromise the security of the assets. So three key parts. You have the assets defined. You then have to understand what the threats are. You have to then understand what are the vulnerabilities that may exist in the environment in which your assets are working on. These three key elements is what we use in our discussion, in our understanding, or in our definition of security architecture. We just don't look at the catalog of systems or elements. We are looking at how do we analyze this dynamic relationship between the different elements of the enterprise, and how do we find the right balance to ensure that we are protecting the assets, we understand the vulnerabilities. We also need to make sure that we are understanding the threats that exist. Now, this brings me to the key point of thought process for an architect. We are not trying to achieve absolute security. Remember, they say a secure system is one that is completely disconnected from everything, placed in a vault, locked in a vault, completely disconnected and switched off with the keys of the vault thrown away. But such a system, we know, is useless. So we have to then be able to find the right balance between putting in the security controls and ensuring that the system remains useful. And this is the concept of risk. So when we are thinking about these vulnerabilities, threats, and assets, we are then trying to interpret that into a risk matrix. We are trying to define, once we now understood the threats that we have, we understood the usefulness and the design and the architecture of the assets, we are then starting to define what is a risk. And when we talk about risk, we are trying to think of it like a multi-dimensional approach where we're trying to say, given these assets that we have, what is the threats and what is the vulnerabilities that exist in the environment? You can almost think of it like a mathematical expression where you're trying to say threat times vulnerability times the asset equals risk. The fourth element about risk is the business impact. Then we say, well, yes, you could have the same risk in that mathematical sense, but depending on what is the environment and what is the business criticality of where the vulnerability and the assets reside, that could have a difference in the way you go about setting your risk. So we think about the fourth vector as the impact that, should this vulnerability be exploited by these threat actors, this is what the impact is going to be on the business. So when I'm thinking about the risk, I'm calculating what is the expected loss. I'm thinking about calculating this from a perspective of the value that would be lost should these things that we are concerned about manifest. So if we have 10 million direct asset loss for a particular system, and that system is connected to another system that could result in a $40 million loss, we are trying to put those things together and express that to the business to make sure that they understand what this means and how do we then ensure that we set the right controls to minimize that impact. Now, the other key point that we talk about when you're looking at systems and looking at architecture is to think about what we call the CIA triad. And in the CIA triad, we are trying to define three key concepts. We are trying to define confidentiality. And in confidentiality, what we're trying to say is, given the assets that we have, we want to ensure that we are protecting its secrecy. So confidentiality predominantly deals with secrecy. Now, remember that the point I made earlier, there's no point in putting something away, an asset, for example, putting it away in a way that it cannot be accessed. That way, that you could achieve confidentiality that way. But remember, it won't be useful. So what we do when we think about confidentiality is to think about authorized access, authorized read. How do we ensure that only those people, individuals, or systems that have a genuine reason and business use to be able to read that information? So we are not just trying to achieve absolute confidentiality, we're trying to achieve confidentiality in a way that it supports the business. The second element that we think about is integrity. Now, you can think of integrity simply as, is it possible that you can think of integrity simply as, is the data that I'm dealing with the data that I really expect? How do I ensure that the data that I'm dealing with hasn't been modified in an unauthorized way? Again, remember, this concept of authorized versus unauthorized is very key to everything that we do. We are trying to ensure not absolute security, but we're trying to ensure that we are defining, if we agree and understand that these are the folks that are authorized to change the data, then we're going to design controls to protect and achieve that particular goal. We're not going to design controls that will say this is absolutely 100% integrity, but we'll say we are achieving integrity based on the threshold, based on the understanding that we can enforce the right level of changes to the data that we have. The last element of that is availability. When you are thinking about availability, we are thinking about, is the data, again, that authorized versus unauthorized point comes back. We are thinking about, is this data or is this system, is this asset accessible, available to the individuals or processes or customers that should have access to it according to the given time and when they are requiring it. So that's the other key point. Now, when we are thinking about cybersecurity, we're trying to find that balance between these three elements. So you can think of it as having a balance point, a point somewhere in this dimension where you're trying to find the right balance. Should we move it closer to the confidentiality? Is integrity more important to us? Is availability more important? So you're trying to find what is the right place for putting this point. Just to give you some examples of how this might be treated differently. So in a banking environment, because we know that we're going to be making decisions based on the data that we have, in that case, we might prioritize integrity. We might say, well, we want to make sure that if we are doing a bank transfer, we have to make sure that the number of zeros in the transaction is absolutely correct. So we might prioritize integrity versus confidentiality. For emergency services, as an example, think about the ambulance. They're trying to respond to an emergency situation. So they may say, well, we want to make sure that the blood group of a particular individual can be available to the medics rather than protecting its confidentiality, because that's a life and death scenario. In the military sense, confidentiality might be more important than availability. They would risk retrieving that data slowly rather than making it easily available, because confidentiality is more important to them. In an e-commerce environment, as an example, you might consider availability. So think about Black Friday. When you have so many transactions, you don't want even a 10-minute outage will be a significant loss for the business. So in that example, you would consider availability to be more important than the other principles that we have. So that's how we think about CIA triad. So when we are designing architecture, we are thinking about the CIA constantly. We are trying to use the CIA to prioritize the things that we're going to put in our environment, the controls and the level of protection that we're going to have to ensure that we are achieving the right balance point. So we are not just thinking about controls, we are building business capabilities that inherently prioritize some elements of the CIA. So another key concept that we rely on in architecture is the concept of defense in depth. So when we are thinking about defense in depth, we are asking ourselves, what are the different layers of protection that we are going to have in order to protect the assets that we have? So think of the assets as something that is in the center of the onion, if you like. Think of defense in depth as an onion. At the center of the onion, you have the assets that you want to protect. And then the rings really represent the layers of protection that you have to ensure that an attacker or someone who wants to compromise the asset, you are trying to enforce that they will have to go through several layers of the onion before they can compromise the assets. So let's take an example of what it looks like. Remember, we talked about the building's architecture, and we are trying to borrow a lot of that in the security architecture world. So what does it mean when you talk about defense in depth in both worlds? So in a building's architecture, you may have a building that is designed to say, well, we suspect or we expect that the attackers would be coming from external. And at a later point, we'll talk about a different philosophy, which is called the insider threat. We'll discuss that later. But for now, assume that we are trying to protect the assets which are sitting somewhere deep in our environment, in the building, and we're trying to design then these perimeters or these protections for the assets. So in the construction world, you may have a building that is designed with a fence. It could be different types of fence. It could be a wall fence, it could be metal fence, etc. And in that fence, you're going to have a gate, or you're going to have an entry point which is controlled. So you're then assuming, or you're trying to achieve security by ensuring that you have to go through a control point in order for you to gain access. So we might say, well, an attacker might look at that and think, oh, wow, I have to find a way to bypass that. So let's imagine that they have a way to jump over the fence. Now, if they jump over the fence, they are now inside the building. In the cyber world, we think of the perimeter, like network perimeter, as a first line of defense. So in that way, we can use things like firewalls to say, you cannot go through into the internal network unless you go through very specific control points. And that's where you can set your firewall policies to say we are allowing traffic which meets this particular criteria. Now, assuming that the attacker passes through that first line of defense, in the buildings world, then we know that the attacker has passed through the first line of defense. And by the way, one of the key principles we apply here is to assume that the attacker would be able to bypass one layer. So when we are designing the next inner layer, we're trying to think of it from a perspective of that layer has to be independent from the previous layer, and it has to completely assume that the previous layer has been bypassed. So in this example now, we can say, well, someone has bypassed the wall fence. They are now inside the yard of the building. In order to get into the building, you have to have a badge. You have to have maybe biometrics as well before you can get into the building. So that becomes the second layer of defense. In the cyber world, we would use things like the identity. We're trying to identify who's this individual before we can allow them to move further on into the environment. So very similar concepts. We're trying to identify what are the credentials they have. How do we ensure that they have who they say they are? And this is where we start applying things like multi-factor authentication. And the key point here, the key vulnerability that the attacker might use is credential theft. If they steal your password, then they might be able to impersonate you, i.e. convince the rest of the systems that they are representing you. Assuming that they bypass that layer, in the buildings world, they would go to a floor. So they land on a floor, and on that floor, maybe it's an elevator. You've seen, maybe if you've gone into hotels, you may have seen elevators that allow you or require you to tap the badge before it goes into a particular floor. We can add additional layers there which says, well, if you can identify that this particular client is on level 5, you can put in additional policies to say they're not allowed to go to level 8, etc., etc. So that is another way of now controlling. So assuming that you pass through the outer doors of the building, you're now in the elevators, you may be required to tap. So in the same way, in the cyber world, we think about network access. We think about network segmentation. Assuming that the attacker lands, they come through the perimeters, they have an identity, then we say they're going to land onto this segment of the network. And then we now enforce policies that prevent or control to which other segments the attacker would be able to go. So that allows us to prevent things that we call like lateral movement and privilege escalation. Assuming that the attacker passes through that, they'll come to a room. Again, in a room, you may have ability to lock the room. You may have some codes. You may have biometrics on that room. The attacker then has to be able to either find a way to bypass that through lock picking or key theft, or maybe they've cloned the keys, they've cloned the cards that are used to protect that room. In the cyber world, we do the same thing. Once the attacker lands on a machine, which we call an endpoint, we are putting in controls on that endpoint to prevent them from making further damage, to prevent them from accessing the data maybe on that endpoint or making other network connections. And this is where we start to think about things like endpoint controls, antivirus, application allow listing, limiting use of administrative privileges on the endpoint. Again, let's go further. So if we assume that the attacker has bypassed that, they're now at the vault. So if they find a vault in a room, they have to be able to then find a way to crack that safe. They have to have either the combination, they could have stolen the combination, but again, they are faced with another layer of defense. In a similar way, in the cyber world, assuming that you bypass all the controls, you are on the endpoint and you get access, you can see the data that you have, we use things like encryption. So we encrypt the data so that the attacker then has to also be able to have the keys. And typically we want to protect those keys in a separate place, which requires additional levels of authorization before we can release those keys. And once they have the keys, let's assume they bypass that, they now have access, then we are now considering things like how do we prevent them from exfiltrating the data. In a similar way, in the cyber world, in the physical world, we may say, assuming that they get access to the documents that they're looking for, they've cracked the safe, they've got the documents out, they still have to then be able to find their way out of the building. So we might be able to catch them as they're coming out of the building. Similar in the cyber world, we also think about ensuring that, assuming that the attacker has a way to get to the assets that we are protecting, how do we ensure that they cannot go outside of the environment? In this way, when we are thinking about these different layers, we think about three key concepts: prevention, detection, and response. So when we are designing the perimeter, the example that we had of the firewall, we are trying to implement a preventative mechanism. We're trying to prevent all access except access through the specific services or specific ports that we've authorized the connections to come through. Now, within the firewall itself, you can also add additional detective controls where you're now looking at detecting the behavior through things like deep packet inspection. You're trying to determine, should we can we detect when the attack is actually on the way? Assuming that the attacker managed to go through all these things, we also have to have a responsive processes as well. So notice how we are using different architectural decisions here. Another example might be, we might say we want to segment the network. Remember, I talked about network segmentation earlier. We might say we want to segment the network. But in segmenting the network, we are not just designing that as a security control. We are also using that as a way to contain. So in the event that the attacker bypasses the various controls that we have, network segmentation can help us isolate the network, isolate the area of attack, or prevent the attacker from moving on to another part of the network. Now, when we are putting these designs together, we are not doing security just for the sake of it. We are trying to protect the business value. We are trying to understand where do we put the controls to allow the business to still be productive while ensuring that we are protecting the business value at the same time. So we normally think about this from a perspective of a matrix, where we are trying to think about what is the impact of the attack on the business, what is the likelihood of that attack happening. So in using that, we establish the language that we can then use to communicate to the business. So remember, security isn't about blocking the business, it's about enabling the business. So in this concept, what the security architect is doing is serving as a bridge. So they're looking at this business strategy, defining the how, defining the blueprints, and then using that to drive the implementation. So they're serving as a glue between the strategy and the implementation of the technology that we have. So now let's put these things together to really understand how does a security architect then go about to design and put these things together. So the way to think about this is that for an architect, they are really thinking about different layers of abstraction and different layers of architecture. So you might start with what we call the business architecture. And in the business architecture, you are trying to understand, as an architect, you're trying to understand what are those critical processes that exist in the business? So it could be user onboarding as an example. It could be transactions like reporting or transactions, payment transactions, and so on. Then you have to be able to understand what are the processes that happen in an organization. So you might have process where a customer, does the transaction, and that transaction maybe needs to flow to compliance for some verification. So you start to see that in your business architecture, you're trying to help define how the information is going to flow in order to support the business. And this takes you into the next layer, which is the information architecture. Now, in the information architecture, then you're trying to understand what is the classifications that we have. In the examples that we've seen, we have personal identification data, you may have payment data, and so on. So you're trying to define what the data that we have, and you're trying to use this to define the level of you're trying to use this to define the level of protection that you're going to have. The next piece is application architecture. So in the application architecture, we're now trying to put the applications that we have. You're trying to define whether it's a banking application, whether it's an e-commerce application. You're trying to define what are the layers that we're going to have within the application itself to ensure that the application will serve the business, but also ensure that the security is met. So we're trying to really understand how the applications are meant to work, what is the level of dependencies between applications, and how does the infrastructure that we have, how is it meant to support the applications. Once we have that, this is where now the core of what the security architect is going to be doing. They've understood their application, they've understood the information flows, they will now start designing the different layers, security controls, that are going to be embedded within the infrastructure, within the applications, and within the information flows and process flows to ensure that we are meeting the business targets. And it's at this point where we start to think about where does it make sense to apply network segmentation? How much security does that allow us to achieve? So you might think about from a perspective of risk reduction. We might say by having network segmentation, we're going to be gaining 85% risk reduction. And the last piece of this is, once we've now designed this, so this will be in the form of blueprints, will be in the form of diagrams and architectural decision records, we then go into the validation. And it's at this point we are doing the design reviews. We're trying to understand, given the design of the system, given this architecture that we've developed and the security controls, how is this going to protect the assets? We use the CIA triad. We are going back to that CIA triad to really understand which parts of the CIA is going to be impacted. How do we reduce the impact on confidentiality? How do we detect? How do we respond? So in this way, the architect is really thinking about the overall picture of how the different parts of the system, how the different layers is going to work, and ensuring that the business will continue to operate in an effective way. Now, in thinking about all this, we have to then remember that security architecture isn't about achieving perfect security. We have to find the right balance point between preserving confidentiality, integrity, or availability. We have to put that in the context of the business goals, the what and the why that the business have defined. And once we have that, then we are designing the blueprints, we are designing the controls, we are helping the technicians, we are helping other engineering folks to really understand how we are going to implement these controls and what configurations are necessary in order to achieve the business goals. Just like construction architects, they balance safety, functional, and the aesthetics of the building, we are balancing security, usability, and business velocity. Now, if this architectural mindset clicked with you, hit the subscribe button and the notification button. Drop a comment. I would like to hear from you. What are some of the controls that you expect? What are some of the challenges that you see in the architecture space? Remember, security isn't just about achieving perfect security. It's about finding the right balance to support the business. See you in the next episode.